Thank you. All right, so I do have a getting started slide up here. So if you're going to be following along, this is a hands-on lab or a hands-on workshop. We're going to be breaking off into like a few different labs. So if you do want to follow along, please go out and get the Git repo and do an npm install, and then hopefully with battling the Wi-Fi and stuff like that, by the time we actually get to the lab portion, we'll be all installed and ready to go. I'm just giving it a minute there. Okay, great. So I will have this slide up again in a few minutes when we get to the lab portion. So if you don't quite got it there yet, don't fret. We'll get the repo URL and stuff back up again. Okay, great. So welcome everybody to this workshop on building awesome backends for Angular devs with NestJS. My name is Eli Lucas, and I am a developer advocate at Ionic. And I'm really passionate about doing web and mobile applications, and I've been doing so for about 20 years now. And I'm extremely honored and excited today to bring you what I think is a pretty cool thing happening with web development today, and that's the ability to do full stack TypeScript applications using Angular and NestJS. But first off, what is a full stack developer? To me, a full stack developer is probably somebody who is efficient at doing code on both the front end and the back end of an application. They may not necessarily be experts in both areas. They probably have a specialty in some area or another. But to me, a full stack developer, if you like a bug request comes in or a feature request comes in, a full stack developer is somebody who's able to take that ticket and implement it end to end. But one thing that I've at least noticed over the past few years is that it's becoming increasingly more difficult to be a full stack developer. And that's mainly because the technologies that we use on both the client and the server are just increasing in complexity more and more and more, right? And if you think about it, like oftentimes nowadays, your front end and your back end are sometimes written in different languages, on different platforms, using different code editors, using different frameworks, and sometimes even on different operating systems. And to expect somebody to be a full stack developer and make that context switch back and forth between those two is a pretty large ordeal. So a few years ago, I was a tech lead on a project, and we had an AngularJS front end and a Java back end. And our development staff was kind of set up to be like 4 JavaScript developers to like 1 Java developer. And it wasn't long until our front end team was like really outpacing our back end team. And so, our initial solution was let's make everybody a full stack developer. Let's get all the JavaScript developers up to speed on Java and whatnot, and get them up and running in IntelliJ and the build processes and stuff that they had to do. And it took a really long time, and the results kind of like went back to the front end developers were front end developers, and the back end developers were back end developers. So we're like, okay, we got a majority of JavaScript developers. What could we do to help improve our efficiency? It's like, well, we have Node. What if we wrote our front end and back end both in JavaScript using Node? And we kind of looked at each other, and we're like, yeah, this sounds like a pretty cool idea, right? Let's do it. Let's get started. And so that's what we did. We had a series of microservices that had to all be written in Node. And at first, it started to go really, really well because Node and Express are really simple, right? You have a route handler, and you have a function. Your function does some stuff and returns back a data that Express serves on out. But what we kind of discovered with all these microservices that we were writing is that the apps kind of went one of 2 ways. And that is kind of because Express doesn't offer a whole lot in terms of guidance on how you should architect your app. So the first thing that we saw was we would open up a project and we'd be like, ooh, right, what is this? Here's like this 1,000-long function route handler that's doing database access and validation and error logging and management all within the same thing, right? We've all seen this before, this giant mess of spaghetti code that you're afraid if you kind of look at it sideways, it's going to break and your system's going to go down, right? These aren't very fun to work in. The second thing that I saw was that we had like a pretty good application architect working on the Express microservice. And they would take the code and kind of abstract it out into different areas of functionality, kind of like their own home-built MVC type architecture, model view controller architecture. And so they had good controllers, they had middleware handling a lot of the cross-cutting concerns, and this was pretty good as well. But the problem with this is that not one application written by one architect was the same as one written by another architect. And it didn't really translate that well. Like if we're trying to bring in other developers into our team, it's like, okay, we have to kind of like train you up on this MVC homegrown framework that we have here. And so the reason that this happens, I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's mainly because Nest or Express does not provide a whole lot of guidance on how to architect an app. And that's where I'd like to introduce you to NestJS. And so I think first and foremost, what you need to know about NestJS is it has a pretty badass kitten logo, right? And if you like cats, you're going to go to the NestJS site and you're going to see cats everywhere. So if you like cats, you're automatically going to like NestJS. The second thing I want you to know, and it's probably a little bit more important than the first, is that Nest is a framework for building backends on top of Node. But not only is it a framework, it's also a platform that you can use to build a variety of different types of applications. So you can use it to build REST-based APIs, GraphQL-based APIs. You can build microservices and real-time communications between clients and servers with NestJS. It's kind of like this all-encompassing platform that provides a lot of the building tools that you need. What makes Nest somewhat unique, though, is that it's a highly opinionated framework. And it really values consistency between applications. And the way that it does that, it has this series of building blocks. And once you get to know these building blocks, you're going to know where your application logic should go for that particular area. Another thing that Nest highly values is having a low learning curve, especially for front-end developers wanting to get into back-end development work. And the way that Nest did this was that they really they're highly influenced by Angular. And so a lot of people will call building a NestJS app kind of like building Angular on the back end. And so there's a lot of concepts that are similar or the same in Nest that they are in Angular. And you'll see that as we go along. But another thing that I think is really cool about NestJS is if you're coming over from some other enterprise grade backend framework, maybe something like an ASP.NET MVC or Web API or a Spring or Ruby on Rails, you're kind of used to this enterprise grade framework and platform to run on. And if you tried Nest or if you tried Express, you might have found it to be a little light. Well, NestJS brings a lot of those enterprise type grade features to you as well. So if you're a backend developer on another platform and you're coming to Node, you'll find Nest has those same similar concepts. But what I like most about Nest is that it makes use of TypeScript. And yes, you could have used TypeScript on Express, but Nest really utilizes TypeScript to its full potential. And as Angular devs, I don't need to tell you why TypeScript is awesome or amazing. I don't need to go into that whole spiel because you already know. But what it comes back to for me, if you remember what kind of one of the things I thought what made a good full stack developer was kind of having similar platforms on both sides. And so when you're using Angular and when you're using Nest, you're using TypeScript, you're probably using the same code editor, you're using the same type of build tooling to build out your application. So switching back and forth between the projects, the context switching is a lot smoother. So here's a list of the Nest building blocks. And as Angular developers, you're going to find a lot of these similar. And that's a good thing because their concepts inside of Nest are very similar to the concepts inside of Angular. And these are kind of like a set of abstractions that once you get to learn these, you're going to know where to put particular types of business logic inside your code. And if you go from project to project, as long as you're following these set of building blocks, it's going to be quick and easy to get up and running on those other types of projects. And so to learn those, you can go to the Nest documentation. This is kind of where I got started. And the first time that I saw the documentation, which by the way, it's really great documentation, there was something about this that really hit home for me that made it feel like this was the framework for me. And if you notice in the top left-hand corner, they have an actual hamburger icon for their menu. And so they actually have a real a real hamburger menu. I was like, okay, like this is a cool framework. Being a mobile developer, I'm all about the hamburger menus and stuff like that. So this is the framework for me. All right, so for this lab, what we're going to do is we're going to build a full stack TypeScript application. And I was trying to think, like, what can we build that's going to, be a good demo app? And the first thing that came to mind was, a to-do app, right? Everybody does to-do apps. They're kind of overdone. But for me, like, this great technology deserves something better than a to-do app, because to-do apps are kind of lame. So I was like, okay, we're here at ng-conf. ng-conf is space themed this year. Let's all be space rangers. And let's build an app that we can use to see a list of missions that we can go on as space rangers. And with it, we can create new missions and whatnot. And I call this Go Space Ranger. And here's the application. And so the application, you're going to get to see a list of missions to go on. You're going to be able to create new missions, give them a reward, mark them as done or not. And you're also going to be able to update and delete them. All right, I know what you're thinking. It's just another to-do app, right? But it's much cooler than that because, we got space rangers. So I mentioned earlier I'm a developer advocate for Ionic. And I want our Go Space Ranger app to be a mobile application that they can use for that. And if you're not familiar with Ionic, Ionic is a set of UI library toolkits that you can use to build mobile applications for iOS and Android. And for this, you don't need to be at all familiar with Ionic. All you need to know is that it's a UI library that's used and just kind of like use the components in there. Most of it's already like laid out for you. But at work, we were talking about this a lot, and we we're kind of like, okay, this is kind of cool. We're going to dub this the Ian stack, so the Ionic, Angular, and NestJS stack. It's the ultimate stack for building full stack TypeScript applications for mobile and web. Okay, in the first lab, what we're going to do is we're going to get our Go Space Ranger app up and running, and we're going to list out the missions. And these, all the way from the back end to the front end in the Angular app. And the concepts that we're going to go over here are controllers, services, and interceptors. So let me introduce those to you real quick. So Nest, when it comes down to it, is an MVC, Model View Controller framework. And so in an MVC framework, controllers are responsible for listening to requests that come in and formulating the responses that go out. And so they often listen to a particular URL. So if you have like a people route, you have a people controller that goes along with it. Or if you have a task route, you have a task controller that goes along with it. And then they send it back out along with the response. Services in Nest are practically identical to services in Angular. They're just a simple Java or TypeScript class that you're going to use that can be injected into other components. And services are like where your database logic goes or your business logic, other types of stuff that you need to do that doesn't really belong in a controller. You want to keep your controllers nice and slim and put the main bulk of your logic inside of services. Next, we have one of these Nest building blocks called Interceptors. And an interceptor is a specialized piece of middleware that lets you peek in to the request as it goes through the system. So you can take a look at the request before it reaches the controller, and after the controller is done with it before it goes out as a response. And there's lots of things you can do with interceptors, lots of cross-cutting concerns like logging or error management. But one of the other really powerful features you can do inside of an interceptor is you can manipulate the data on the way out. So let's say you have like a particular schema that your responses need to adhere to. You don't need to worry about like manipulating your data object inside of your controllers to do that. You can do that inside of the interceptor. So your controller just returns the data. The interceptor can manipulate it into a particular schema to go out as a response. So here we are at lab 1. So if you didn't get the Git repo yet, there's the URL again for it. And in this, we're going to take 15 minutes as soon as we start. And then all the labs are broken apart into branches inside of Git. And so you can do lab 1-start to be at the beginning point, or if you just want to like jump to the end, you can do lab 2 or lab 1-complete to get to the end point. And all the other labs are going to follow that same concept. So I'm going to give you a brief tour of the application here real quick. And so once you get the repo cloned and you go into the repo and you npm install, what you want to do to fire up the development server is npm run dev. Now, this application here, it's kind of like highly customized for this lab, And so Nest or Ionic doesn't come out of the box like running both the servers. It's special built for this. But what this is basically doing is it's firing up the Angular development server and the Nest backend server using one npm command. And so I'll run that and jump into code. And actually, the first thing I want to show you is the guide. And so this is the guide that you'll be going through for all of your labs and exercises. So you got links over here to get to the particular labs. Thank you. There we go. Okay, so as you're going through the labs, if you're using Visual Studio Code and you click on one of the links right here, it's going to open up that file for you directly inside of Visual Studio Code. If you're not using Visual Studio Code, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go to the file the old-fashioned way, but this is going to take you to where you need to go. And the application itself is kind of like a paint-by-numbers type deal. I'm going to give you like the methods to implement, and you can use the copy button, or you can type in the code yourself to go into it, but it's going to be like pretty much like here's a method, put it in this particular file, or replace a particular method in a file with it. And to give you a quick overview, how this is going to work is I'm going to do it, and then we're going to take a break for the lab for you guys to do it. And so to show you the structure of the sample application, we got the source directory that's broken apart into three parts. The client, which is where the Angular app is at. The server, which is the Nest app, and a shared folder, which is a folder for some shared models and code. Let me know in the back if that's big enough for you. Okay, so inside of the server, we got the app directory, and in here we have missions. And we already have our missions controller set up as well as a missions service. Another thing that the lab is already set up with, like all the imports are already done for you, so you don't have to worry about figuring out like which files that you need to import into the TypeScript files or whatnot. And anything that's injected in either Angular or Nest is already injected for you as well, so you don't need to worry about injecting the dependencies. And so we got a missions controller and we got a missions service. Another thing that we have that's already set up is this missions repository. This is a fake file-based database set up and ready to go for you, because I didn't want to have to worry about you connecting to a real database on your backend, which database you're going to use and whatnot. And so we're going to use this mission repository as our kind of like backend for our Nest app. All right, so the first thing we want to do is inside of our mission service, we want to retrieve a list of missions from the database so our controller can get access to them. And so I'll write a method, and it'll be called getMissions, and we'll just simply return the list from the missions repository. And if you take a look here at what's being returned, we're returning a promise of array of mission entities. And to show you the mission entity real quick, it's just a very simple data model around our mission data. So we got a title, reward, active, and a couple of fields right here that are kind of for the database that we'll get into here in a moment. Now that we have the service returning the missions, let's go into our controller. And so this is a Nest controller. And so remember, controllers listen to requests coming in. So controllers are decorated with a controller's decorator, and then we provide it the path that it's going to listen for on this particular route. And so here it's listened to /missions. And when we make a GET request to /missions, what we do is we use the GET decorator to specify that when a GET request comes in to this particular route, this is going to be the method that's going to respond to that GET request. So we'll call into the mission service. Looks like I misnamed that. This is getMissions. And so now it's kind of just a simple pass-through right now. Okay, so the question was, how does a get decorator know the URL that it's looking at? So this get decorator right here is part of Nest. And so when Nest fires up the framework and it's controlling all the interactions and a get request comes in, it's going to look at this particular class and say like, hey, do you have this get decorator or a get decorator to satisfy this request? And if you do, I can call that method. Okay. Now I have autosave turned on, so like when sometimes this messes up people when I'm doing it. I'm not particularly going in and saving files. They just all autosave. It probably takes 5-ish seconds or so for the Nest server to kick back in. But if I come in here and I do a get request to /missions, I get back a list of, sorry about that. Here we go. I get back a list of missions in JSON format. And so one thing to note there was that our mission service was returning back a promise, and we just like passed through that promise straight through. That's kind of one of the nice things about Nest is whether if you just return a synchronous data call or an asynchronous data call, Nest is going to take care of unwrapping that for you. Yeah, question? So the question was, does Nest use RxJS at all? And yes, it does. We'll get into that in a little bit. Okay, but you might notice here that on our the data that's being returned, we have a couple of fields here that are kind of like metadata fields for the database. They're not necessarily fields that you would want to return back to the client. So we got this created at and a created by. And so what we could do is, like in our controller, we can get the data back, and then we can create a new object and just exclude those properties. But we're using TypeScript here, and there's a TypeScript library called Class Transformer. And Class Transformer provides a set of decorators that you can put onto your class, and when you run it through a special helper function, it's going to transform your class for you. So I'll show you how that works here real quick. So if we go back into the entity, here we can use the exclude decorator from Class Transformer. And if you look up here, exclude is included from Class Transformer. And so now that we have that inside of our controller, what we could do is we could say, const return data equals this dot mission service dot get missions, and then we can return, we can call the helper method class to plain, which converts the class into a plain JavaScript object, and if it has any of those special decorators, it's automatically going to run those transformations on them, and then pass in the return data. So we could do this, but you might notice something right now. You're going to notice something about me is I like to keep my controllers super, super slim. And any type of logic like this, I know I'm going to have to repeat all over the place, and that's just not something I want inside my application. So we can use one of those concepts from Nest, the interceptors, to manipulate this data on the way out. So let's go ahead and do that. So there is a file in here called data.interceptor.ts, and I've got some snippets here so you don't have to see me type in a bunch of code. But what we're doing here, and so this intercept method intercepts the request coming in, and this is where it's using a little bit of RxJS. And so RxJS has this handle, which is a subscription. And before the controller gets a hold of it, we can run some code up above. But as soon as handle is called, it's going to return it back as an observable. And we can look at that, and we can use the map operator to transform the data on the way out. And so we're using map, and we're also specifying a little bit of a schema here for our application to use. We're going to return back a JSON object that has a data property on it that's going to contain our data. And then we'll call that class to plain object in here. So to use interceptors inside a Nest, there's a few different ways that you can do so. You can use a decorator called useinterceptors and place it on the actual method that you want to use. Or you could also use that decorator at the class-based level, so it will apply to all the methods in that class. Or you can do it at the application level. And to do it at the application level, you set it up inside of Nest Dependency Injection Framework, which is very similar to Angular's Dependency Injection Framework. And so what we'll do here is in the providers, we'll create a new one. We'll provide a token called app interceptors. And so this is saying like, hey, whenever you encounter an interceptor, fire up this class and use it in its place. And so we'll put in data interceptor into here. Okay, and then once everything is recompiled, we'll come back over here. Now you can see that those particular items that we did the exclude on are now not a part of our output. Okay, so now that we're returning back a list of missions from the backend, let's display them inside of the Ionic app. And so up in the Ionic app, it's kind of architected the same way. We have a mission service, which is where we're going to make our HTTP requests. And so here, we just got a get missions method that's making the HTTP request to the local host right now, to the missions, and then it's piping it back out. And we're running a map operator because when we get our schema, we're going to take off that data again and only return back the list of missions, not the whole data or response schema. And then inside of our home page, we're going to call that method. And so we already have a missions observable set up inside of here. Let's say this.missions equals this.missionService dot get missions. And if everything is good inside of the Ionic app here, see now we have our list of missions. Now I'm going to fire up the Chrome DevTools, and I'm actually going to enable device emulation mode here, so we get it in a nice mobile view set. But now you can see that we have the list of missions showing back up. So we're going to break out now and do lab 1. And I'll be walking around, so if you have any questions or anything, feel free to ask. But yeah, go back into the guide and consult the guide. And I'll just put that up there. And so we'll get started now. All right. So that is the end of lab 1. If you didn't quite get finished, don't fret. You can pick up where you left off at the next lab, or you can use the Git branches to kind of start fresh with the next one. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create the mission detail screen. And as a part of creating the mission detail screen, we're going to add into our API the ability to pull back a single mission based on an ID. And the concepts that we're going to go over this on the Nest side are pipes and exception helpers. So pipes are another one of these Nest building blocks, and they're another piece of specialized middleware that kind of sits in front of your request before it comes in. So if you remember interceptors, it kind of sat on both ends. Pipes sit on the front end. You kind of might be wondering, why do we have these two different things that kind of feel like they're the same? But it comes down to that Nest is highly opinionated, and when you see something called interceptor, you're going to have an idea of what it's doing. And when you see something called pipe, you're going to have another idea what it's doing. So pipes are fairly similar to what they are in Angular. A lot of the times they're used to transform data before it gets into the controller. But another very common use case for pipes is validation, and we'll be getting into that in a little bit as well. So let me go through the lab real quick. Okay, and so what we're going to do to start off here is we're going to go into our server-based mission service. And this is something that you kind of want to be a little careful with, because now we have multiple files with the same name in different projects. So when you're going through, like, just make sure you're like modifying the server one or modifying the client one, depending on the right situation. And we're going to create a method in here called getMission. And we're going to pass in an ID that is a number. And then we'll return back this .missions repository.get, and this takes in the ID. And if we look at the return type here, it's just a promise that returns back a single instance of mission entity. On the controller side, very similar. So we're going to make another GET request, but now we're going to make a GET request to the URL of like mission/1 or mission/2, whatever the ID is that we're trying to request. So to specify that route, we again use the GET, but now we're going to pass it a parameter. And so this looks a lot like it does in Angular. You say, in Angular routing, you say :/ whatever you want to name the parameter. And we'll say getMission. And then we're going to pass in ID into it. Now, what we need to do to tell Nest that this ID is coming from our URL is we use a specialized param decorator. And we give it the name. And so this name right here maps to the name that we did here when setting up the route. So now we can say return this .mission service .getMission and pass it in the ID. And when we go back and give it a second for the server to kick in. So now if I go to missions/1, you can see I'm not getting anything back right now. Anybody want to take a gander at why this isn't working? All right, well, let's debug it. Right? So we're using TypeScript, we're using Visual Studio Code in my particular case. I can do debugging in the application. So I'll come in here and I'll set a breakpoint right here, and I'll hit F5 to attach my debugger. I already have that task set up. And come back in, refresh, take a look to see what's going on here. We got ID. Uh-oh. ID is being passed in as a string because all URL parameters are strings, but our mission service is expecting a number to be passed in. So, it's trying to look it up by that, and it's not finding anything. And what we really did here is we kind of lied to TypeScript about the object that's coming in here. Well, what we could do, and so once this number comes in, we can, say const new ID equals parse int, so like that, but we don't want to be doing that type of logic. We told TypeScript that this is supposed to be a number, right? Let's use that information to convert this to a number on the way in. And we'll use a pipe to do that. And so we'll go into the data.pipe file, and this data.pipe file takes a transform method, and we'll replace that with our own. And once again here, we're using the class transformer library. And so one of the things that class transformer can do is we saw class to plain earlier. Now we're going to look at plain to class. So we're getting plain objects coming in. We want to convert it to a particular type. And because we're using TypeScript and we're emitting type metadata, Nest knows about all of your parameters, the types that they're supposed to be, and all that fun stuff. And so that's what's in this argument metadata. And so we're going to take the meta type from it, and we're going to call plain to class. And so the first parameter here is the object that it's supposed to be converted, or the type that it's supposed to be converted to. And the second parameter is the actual value. So we call that here, and then pass it in. And I will come here to the app model and also make this available so that it is application-wide. And so I'll say provide. Now we'll say app pipe. Use class data pipe. And these are just called data because I'm not very creative when naming things. So if that goes through okay. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. I didn't hear. Okay. So the question was, where is app pipe and app interceptor coming from? These are tokens provided by Nest, and they are imported from Nest right here, from the NestJS core library. All right, so now if I refresh it, I can see I am now getting back my correct mission. So now let's go in and hook this up to the Angular app. So I'll go into the mission service on the client side. And very similar, we will have a get mission that takes in the ID. And here in the URL, we're passing in the ID. And we have, what we're going to do is in the home page, the way that we're going to view the details. And so this is the home page using the Ionic framework. You can see up here, we got the header, and then down here we got the Ion list where we have a bunch of list items where each one of the missions is being used. And on each particular item, we have a click handle. We're calling open mission, where we're passing in the mission. So we'll go into the home page, and the open mission right now is just a blank method. So I'll take it out and use my snippet to paste in open mission. And what we're doing here is we're going to present the mission in a modal. And so we're using the modal controller here in Ionic, and we're passing it in the component that we want it to display and giving it the ID of the mission to use. And then we're presenting it, and this is an asynchronous operation, and so this will await until the modal is closed, and then you get some data that gets returned back from the modal itself. So in this particular case, we're returning back an object, and we're gonna have a Boolean on it called refresh missions. And this is going to let the home page know, like if we make an edit or if we add a new one or something like that, to call the API again to get a fresh list of the data. The reason why this would be false is if we just dismiss the modal without making any actual changes. So now in the mission form, on this ng on init, I'll take that guy out and replace it here. And so we got this nav params that's being injected. And so this is how we're going to get the ID that was passed into the modal. So we call nav params.data.id. And then here, if we have an ID, we're going to call the get mission by ID. If for some reason the ID wasn't passed in, it means that we're creating a new one, which we'll get into in the next section. And so it pulls it back, sets it to the mission object, and here in the component itself, it's just another simple Ionic page. We've got the header, and we got a content area with a list and some form fields. So we got a couple text boxes and a switch to control if it's active or not. So if this is all good, and I click one of these guys, there we go. I get the details page popping up here in a modal. And so we'll do that for lab 2. In lab 3, we'll get to the actual editing and creating portion of it. So start the timer again at 15 minutes and walk around. If you have any questions, just reach out and holler at me. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get back to it. So just remember, like if at sort of the next lab, if you didn't finish, you can continue on or use the Git repos to get you back up to speed. So next, what we're going to be looking at is finishing out the CRUD operations for our missions. So being able to create new ones, update existing ones, and delete them. And one of the Nest concepts that we're going to take a look at here is validation, to make sure that when the objects come in, that they're valid objects. Like the required fields are there, and numbers are numbers, and stuff like that. So to walk you through it here real quick, what we want to do is go into the mission service, and we'll add all the rest of the methods for our CRUD operations. once again, I forgot to stop the PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, so in here, I'll use this little snippet. And so this is kind of a lot of the same stuff that we've seen. We got a create mission, it's taking a mission, it's calling the repository to create it. This update mission, it's a little bit different because what we want to do here is we pull back a mission that's already in the database. And since we have those metadata fields, we want to make sure those metadata fields aren't updated inadvertently. Since they're the created at and created by, they should be the original values. So what we do here is we just set those values from the old one to the new one that's coming in. And then we call the update on the repository for it. And delete mission is also, pretty straightforward. On the controller side, we'll add these methods. And so here, now we're using a few new decorators from Nest. We've got the post decorator. So this is saying when a post request comes in to this particular route handler, this is going to be the method that's going to respond to it. And in here, we're taking in the mission entity. And so we're using this body decorator. And what this is going to do, this tells Nest to populate this object from the request body that's coming in. And so we'll send like a JSON object in the request body, and it's going to automatically map that into our object here. Cool thing about this, like if you're doing this in Express, you might have to set up like body parser or something like that to get it all up and running. Nest supports it all out of the box. Kind of the same deal with put. So we're putting to a particular URL here, so we're specifying our ID as a parameter again, and then same thing with delete. Let's go into the mission service on the client side. A lot more of the same. So we're just filling out the rest of the methods, still kind of doing the same thing, making HTTP requests. And over here on the form side, so we got our form modal right here. And when we submit, we're calling the submit method, and we're just submitting the mission that's currently attached to the form right now. And if we go in here, the submit method right now, all it's doing right now is logging out the mission to the console, but we'll delete that, and we'll add a new one. And so what we're doing here, if we have the mission ID, once again, if we have a mission ID, we know it's an existing mission, we're going to call the update mission service. If not, we're going to call create mission. And then, once it's done, we're going to dismiss the modal. So it will go away and get us back to the list. And we'll set the refresh message to true, so the list screen knows to pull the data fresh again. And what we're doing here is if there's an error that happens during the process, we're going to show an alert. And to show an alert in Ionic, we use the alert controller, and we create it, give it a header. We'll display the error message in the subheader, the regular message, and then an OK button to dismiss it. And over here on the home page, so up in the header, we have a button for adding. And this button right here calls the new mission method. And so we'll fill that out real quick. And so here it's kind of the same thing that we did when we were displaying a mission that was already there. We're using the modal controller to create it, passing in the mission form component, but here we're not passing in the ID, so the form's going to know that it's to create a new mission object for us instead of using the one that's passed in. Okay, and if everything is all good there, so click the button, we get the modal up, we'll give it a mission, take out the space trash with a reward of 100, mark it as active, and now we get it back here in our list. If I click it here, I should be able to do it. This is often what I tell my wife when she gives me a list of things to do, like, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. And then she's like, okay, well, you won't get a reward then. And I'll save that. And there we go. Okay, so now we're able to create an update, but what if we tried to save an object that was like invalid? And so if I try to do this, not specifying a title, not specifying a reward, I'm getting back like a 500 error right now from my server, and it says internal server error. If you ever get back a 500 error, what you can do is you can go into the console that you started up the Nest server from, and let me make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. But this is going to show you the output of the error right here. And so if we look, we can see we have a DB constraint error, title is required. But throwing a 500 error for that is not really what we want to do. What we want to do is we want to throw a 400 bad request type of exception and actually like put some validation in place to make sure those things are there before they actually hit the database, preferably, not after. So let's see how to do that. So we talked about the class transformer library earlier. Class transformer has a sibling library called class validation. And class validation uses validate.js underneath the hood, but what it does that's really cool is it lets us use decorators on our models to specify the validation in a very declarative type manner instead of like writing a bunch of JavaScript to apply the decorations. So I can go back into the mission entity. And up in here, I can specify these decorators like is defined. So to make sure that it's actually coming back as part of the payload. And I can say is not empty to make sure they're not sending in an empty string. And then we can just make sure, we can say is string to make sure that this particular title right here is a string. And we'll kind of do the same thing for number. We'll make sure it's defined. And we'll make sure it is a number. And for active, we'll make sure it's defined. And we'll make sure it is a Boolean. Now, in order to actually use this, we pass it through a helper function, kind of like class transformer, but class validator has a helper function called validate. And so one way that we could do it, if we come up here to the post method, I could come up here and write my validation logic here. So I can say const errors equals validate, and pass it in the mission. I have to spell errors right, or else it's not going to work. And I can say if errors.length. Oh, this validate, it is an asynchronous function, so we'll await on it. And it just returns back an array of errors. So say if the length is greater than 0, then we will throw a new, throw new bad request exception. I'm sorry. Can you, so the question was, can you send parameters to bad request exceptions? And the answer is yes. So if you come in here, you can see that the first thing it takes is a message, and then it also takes like an error. I think it's a little bit up to you to define like what each of those means to your application. Yep. But we'll leave it blank right now. And so once that goes, we'll give it a second to finish compiling and hit save. So now we can see we're getting back an API error that at least says bad request. And down here, you can see that we're actually getting back a 400. So we're returning back the appropriate status code now, but what we're missing is I'm not looping through that errors array and outputting out messages and stuff like that. But once again, I got some cruft here inside of my controller, and I don't like a bunch of cruft inside of my controllers. This is kind of logic that I'd have to repeat everywhere once again. So fortunately, Nest provides some of its building blocks to help with this, and that, once again, is pipes. So kind of the appropriate place to do this type of logic is to put it into a pipe. And I could come in here and add it to my data pipe. Not necessarily a big fan of that because it's kind of breaking the single responsibility principle for this particular pipe. This pipe is meant to convert values on the way in, not to do validation. So you could create your own validation pipe and do that, but the creators of Nest knew that this was going to be such a common task that there is a validation pipe that's built into the framework that you can use that uses class validator. And so we won't worry about creating our own. We'll just go ahead and use the one that Nest provides for us. And so up here in the app module, I'll go ahead and add that. So once again, it is available globally to my, and I'll say app pipe, and I'll use class validation pipe. And if we take a look at validation pipe, you can see that it's imported from NestJS/common. And let that go for a moment. Question? You could write your own custom validation pipe if you wanted to. And so now I'm getting back bad requests, but the format that's coming back isn't the format that this wire is like really fidgety. Isn't in the format that it was expecting. So let's go ahead and write a helper method inside of our service to handle that. So go back into mission service on the client side. And to use this handle error, or insert this handle error. So all we're doing here, so we're taking a look. If there's an error that comes through and its status code equals 400, we're going to loop through each of those error messages that come back. And kind of right now all I'm doing is like putting them all in a big string and displaying them. But there's a lot of data that comes back as part of these error messages. It's going to let you know like the field that caused it, and it's going to let you know which one of the particular decorators we use that also caused it. So you could get really fancy with this and like actually put the errors inside of your form if you wanted to or whatnot. And then to use this, instead of just rethrowing the error, we'll just say this dot handle error in each of these blocks here. Okay, so if I go to create and I hit save, now I get a much better experience of like seeing like what's actually wrong with my form. And since we kind of put our business logic into a centralized place and we're using it everywhere, it also works for updates as well. So if I leave title blank here, you can see that we get it back, title should not be empty. Now, I encourage you to take a deeper look into the class validator library. There's tons of validators that you can do. I want to show another one real quick. So if I go back into my mission entity, for this reward here, earlier I put in a negative reward. And that's definitely not going to get me to take out the trash, so I'm going to make sure, or I'm going to say a min, and then specify that it has to at least be a non-negative number here, using this decorator. So if we come back in here, let it compile, we'll open up this one that had the negative number. So if I hit save here, now I get reward must be not be less than 0. And if you wanted to, you could override that error message so it's not so robotic. Okay, and the last thing in this lab, what we're going to do is we're going to hook up this delete button. And to go back into the form, the delete button is currently calling a delete method and passing in the mission. And so here in, this isn't keeping track. We'll get rid of that. And we'll put in the delete method. And so here what we're doing is we're throwing up another alert modal. And we're providing them with a couple different options. So we're just making sure that, are you sure you want to delete this particular entity? We give them a no, or we give them a yes. When they click yes, we give them a handler that's going to take care of it. And this is just making the call into the mission. And if there happens to be an error, displaying the error. So So I'll come down here, and now I can hit this. So if I hit no, it just goes away. But if you hit yes, it deletes the mission. Cool. All right, so that is going to be lab 3. We'll give you another 15 minutes on the clock, and I'll be walking around, so if you have any questions, let me know. So we'll continue on. I'd like to say thanks for sticking around up until this lab, because personally, I think this portion is the coolest part of Nest and what you can do here using the power of TypeScript on the server. So we're going to get a little bit into authorization. And this is going to be kind of maybe a little bit of a hokey of an example, because we're not actually doing like authentication. We're not providing like usernames or passwords. You'll see when we get to it, we're just like saying, hey, we're a user, or hey, we're an admin. But we're going to see like how we could go about like implementing a roles-based authentication system using NestJS. So in here, we're going to be doing some custom decorators. And so Nest has a bunch of mechanisms that you can use to build your own decorators. We've already seen like how powerful they already are for some of the other uses, but now we're going to start to build some of our own. And in here, we're also going to use guards. And a guard in Nest is a lot like a guard inside of Angular. It's another piece of specialized middleware that implements a particular interface that has a method that all you have to do is return a Boolean value, or true or false. And so you can do all your logic. You can take a look at the headers coming in to see who the user is, call into authentication services or whatnot, and see, hey, does this user actually belong, make it, or have access to make this particular request, and just simply return a true or false if that's going to happen. Okay, so first off, what I want to show, let's get out of here. Is how we're going to do this roles-based authentication. So I already have a decorator created that is called roles.decorator.ts. And this came from using the Nest CLI. And this is actually what it creates for you out of the box. There's nothing more that you need to do to set this up. But what this is doing is saying, hey, we're going to create a decorator called roles that's going to take in an array of string arguments. And to see what that looks like, if we come back over here to the controller, we'll set up a system that says like, hey, we'll let anybody make GET requests, but we want to make sure that you're authenticated to make posts, updates, and deletes. And to do a post, we're going to say, hey, we're going to say roles, you need to be a user. For updates, we'll also say users can do updates as well. But for deletes, we want to make sure you're an admin role. That way, you're just not getting rid of your space missions without completing them. Now, in order, what we need to do though is that Nest needs to be like aware of like what roles are particularly available, and we'll use the auth guard for that. So up here in auth guard, we have this can activate method that returns that Boolean value, and this is just another provider service like any other. So we can inject items into here. So you can see we're injecting a user service. And this user service is pretty simple. We got our user set up. We got a user or an admin. And then based on that, we have their roles. And so a user has a user role, and then an admin has a user and an admin role. And so we will replace this can activate with our own can activate. And this looks, I'm going to walk you through this here because this is a little bit long. So the first thing that we're doing is we're switching to an HTTP context. And that's because Nest can work in different types of contexts. It could be working as a microservice, or it could be working as a WebSocket server or something like that. So we switch to HTTP so we get the proper data back on it. We're defining a token and a user. And what we're doing here is we're taking a look at the authorization header. And so if the authorization header starts with bearer, because we're going to use bearer-based authentication, what we want to do is we want to get that token from it. And this isn't like a JOT or anything. It's just a simple string that we're playing with in this demo. And then we'll call in the user service with that token, get back the user. If we don't find a user, we're going to return back false, because it probably means that they're messing around with their token. But if we do find a user, we're going to attach it to the request. So remember that for later. So if we get here, now we're going to check for the required roles. And what this is doing, so this is going to look for that roles decorator. And if it exists, it's going to return back those roles that we specified in that decorator. And if it doesn't, if it returns back undefined, we're just going to assign it an empty array. Now here, we're saying that if the required roles is blank, that means that we probably never put the roles decorator on it, so we want to let people through. So we return true. If it's not blank, if the user is logged in, we're going to or not logged in, we're going to return back false. And then all we do here in the last portion is we check to make sure that the user has that role in the list of required roles and return back a Boolean value based on that. So if we take a look at our Ionic app real quick, up here in the menu, we have a login, and you can either log in as a user or log in as an admin. So I'll go ahead and log in as a user. If I come up here and try to create a user, oh, I forgot to add the auth guard to our module so it could be used. So down here in the providers, we'll say app guard and use class of auth guard. Give that a second to recompile, and if I hit save here, there you go. I'm now getting a forbidden resource. But I logged in as a user, but what we're not doing is right now, we're not currently sending that authorization header through. And so one way that we can do that inside of Angular is to use an Angular interceptor that will look at every HTTP request, and we can say, hey, if the user is logged in, let's automatically add that authorization header to the request. So we have a auth interceptor, and this has an intercept method, and I'll go ahead and replace it with our own. And this is pretty simple. So inside of local storage, we're just storing what they're logged in as under a key called auth token. If it's not there, we just let the request go on through. If it is there, we're setting that bearer token with the value of the auth header. And this is what it looks like here. So we've got the auth token, and right now I'm logged in as user. So now I should be able to come back in here, and inside of here I can say, I'll just say test and give a reward of 1,000, hit save. Okay, I'm able to create, and come back up here, 222, mark it as active. I can update, but if I go up here to delete, you can see I once again get back that unauthorized request exception. So I can come over here and now log in, I'll log out. And I'll come back over here and log in as admin, and you can see over here the value of the token changed to admin token. And once I delete it, boom, now I can delete it. Now the really cool thing here, since I attached the user to the request, I now have access to the user inside of my controller functions. So one thing I could do, we can pass the request directly into as a parameter. And let's just say for post. So I could use a decorator called request, REQ as any. And if you remember, our mission entity has a created by field on it that right now just defaults to user. But we could say mission.created by equals req.user.id. And this would work. We can access the request, but we can go one step further, and we can actually create our own decorator to inject an actual user into our parameters instead of the request object itself. And to do that, we have this get user decorator. And so this is another CLI command that you can run from the Nest CLI to create a custom parameter decorator. And this is going to pass you back some data, but it's also going to pass you back the request object. And so here we can just say return req.user. And directly in our controller, instead of passing in the request, we can now use this decorator, get user, to return a user to us. And so now we can just say user.id. And I'll set a breakpoint here and run it. So now when we go in and create a new mission, you can see we have our user already attached there. So these custom param decorators, they can like really help clean up your controller code if you're passing in like custom objects and stuff like that. All right, so this is normally where I would start lab 4, but since it's a lab 4, I'm going to say this is homework. So you can take it with you. But if you do have any questions during it, here's a list of resources for you. So we got the NestJS website for their great documentation. Also a little bit more information about how to get started, how to install it, since kind of everything came pre-baked in the demo package. And then if you want some more information about Ionic, that's our website address. Ionic is 100% free and open source. So check it out if you want to do mobile application development using your existing Angular skills. And I'm also writing a series kind of along the same concept, but it goes a little bit deeper into Nest and Ionic and database access and stuff like that. So there's the link to the first post in that blog series. If you want to chat, you can hit me up on Twitter at Eli Lucas. Or immediately following this session, I'm going to be up in the Ask Me Anything room on the 3rd floor in Udubon. And also who's going to be there is Camille, who is the creator of Nest. And so if you have like more like deep dive particular questions about Nest, you can go there and actually talk with the creator. He's going to be in the room at the same time. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to my session, and hope you have a great rest of the conference.